What if the only one who ever fought to protect you was the very person everyone else wanted to erase from existence? There was a god. No temples in his name, no festivals, no prayers, no sacred hymns, no poets sang his praises. No mortals dared to call upon him, while the other gods were worshipped for wisdom, beauty, light, and justice. He was shunned, feared, erased from the glory of Olympus. Not because he was weak, but because he was a mirror no one wanted to look into. He didn't glorify war. He didn't romanticize sacrifice. He didn't promise victory. He came when no one else would, when the battle had already begun, when blood had already spilled. He fought not for admiration, but because someone had to. His name was Ares, son of Zeus and Hera, a god of war not born for conquest, but born to carry pain. Ares wasn't evil. He was just unwanted. He was the god who bled for those who cursed his name, the warrior who stood alone while Olympus turned their backs, the one who understood that true strength is not the roar of triumph, but the silence of being rejected by the very ones you protected. Today, we won't tell the story of heroes you've heard 1,000 times. Not Athena with her flawless logic, not Apollo, radiant with light, not even Zeus, ruler of the sky. Today we tell the story of the one who never got his glory, the god they all hated, the warrior who never lost a battle, but always lost the war inside his heart. This is Ares, not the monster, but the most human god of them all. What if the only one willing to protect you was the one everyone else wanted gone? That's not the start of a tragic poem. It's the forgotten truth behind a god they all wanted erased. His name was Ares, the god of war, but also the god none of the other gods could love. Long before the clash of spears and chariots, long before mortals lit temples in his name, Ares was born not from peace nor partnership, but from pain. The story begins with Hera, queen of the gods and wife of Zeus. But this wasn't a love story. This was revenge. Zeus had fathered dozens of children with mortals, goddesses, and even ideas. Athena herself sprang from his skull, fully grown. But Hera, she had no part in it, so she did what no goddess had ever dared. She created a child without him. No father, no union, only divine anger sharpened like a blade, and from that fury, Ares was born. But this birth was not celebrated. There were no banquets, no hymns, only silence, because the gods knew this child would never be theirs. Not truly, born from vengeance, shaped by wrath. He wasn't a symbol of peace. He was the living force of violence itself, and worse, he was the kind of truth the gods didn't want to see. Ares cried louder than any child. But it wasn't fear. It was a scream of fire, iron, and future war. While the others learned music and wisdom, he learned how to be feared. Zeus ignored him. Athena outshone him. Even Hera, his own mother, treated him like a curse she couldn't undo. Imagine that. Being born into the home of gods, only to find you're the one they hope never grows up. And so, Ares was sent away, not formally banished, but quietly discarded. He grew up not in Olympus, but in Thrace, a land of wolves, storms, and chaos. There, among warriors and beasts, he learned the only language anyone would teach him: war. But war wasn't his addiction. It was his armor. He didn't seek it out to destroy. He sought it because it was the only place he wasn't ignored, the only place he knew who he was. In the fields of Thrace, every tree bore the scars of lightning. Every river carried the bones of fallen kings. There were no prophecies here, only survival. And that's what Ares became. Not a god of glory, not a tactician, a survivor. When he finally returned to Olympus, he came back not as a boy, but as a storm in bronze armor. The gods were silent. They had hoped he'd vanish. But instead, he had become stronger, not in favor, not in cleverness, but in force. He was the god of what no one wanted to admit. That when peace fails, it's Ares you need. But even then, no statues were built in his honor. No children were named after him. They needed him. But they hated that they needed him, because Ares was the god of war. But more than that, he was the mirror they couldn't look into, a reminder that power isn't always poetic, that sometimes protection doesn't wear a crown, it wears scars. That was how it began. Not the rise of a hero, not the birth of a villain, but the making of a weapon, one that would spend eternity trying to be seen as more than a blade. Long before the battlefield, before the blood and fire, before Olympus cast its judgment, Ares was born not from love, but from revenge. Legend says that Hera, queen of the gods, grew resentful. Zeus, her husband, had fathered countless children with mortal women. Athena even was born straight from his head without her involvement. So Hera did something unthinkable. She decided to create a child on her own. No man, no god, no partner, only rage. And from that divine fury, Ares came into the world. But this wasn't a birth filled with celebration. There were no golden cradles or blessings from the gods. No prophecies of greatness or songs sung by muses. Instead, the skies stayed silent, because Olympus already knew. A child born from wrath would grow into something they would never control. Ares cried louder than any infant the gods had ever heard. And it wasn't the cry of pain. It was the scream of something ancient, something primal, the scream of war. From the very beginning, Ares didn't belong. Zeus barely acknowledged him. The other gods looked on with quiet suspicion, and even Hera, his own mother, felt conflicted. She had created a weapon, but not one she loved. Imagine growing up, surrounded by immortals, each one more admired than the last, each with temples and mortals who adored them. And you? You're the unspoken name, the one they fear behind closed doors. Ares was exiled, not by decree, but by silence. Sent away to Thrace, a wild, untamed land. He grew up among chaos and beasts, far from Olympus's polished halls, while Apollo was learning music, and Athena studied wisdom. Ares learned only one thing: how to survive. In Thrace, violence was the language of nature. Storms didn't ask for permission. Wolves didn't negotiate, and Ares, left to raise himself, became a reflection of the world he knew. He didn't learn to hate. He learned to protect. He fought not for conquest, but because no one else ever stood up for him. Because every time danger came, no one else came to help. As he grew older, Olympus began to whisper. The gods had hoped he would vanish into obscurity. But Ares returned, not as a child of rage, but as a warrior, fierce, unrelenting, a walking storm clad in bronze and flame. Still, no matter how strong he became, he remained an outsider. When mortals called upon Athena to guide their armies, they begged her for strategy, for clever victories. But when war broke out, real war, brutal, bloody, chaotic, uncontrollable war, they didn't call for Athena anymore. They cried out to the god no one dared to name, and he came. Every time. But even then, even as he saved cities and crushed monsters, even as he stood between mortals and extinction, he received no prayers, no honors, no peace, because Ares wasn't the hero they wanted. He was the one they needed, only when it was too late. And in the shadows of Olympus, the other gods smirked. They saw him not as a brother or ally, but as a blunt instrument, useful only when things got ugly, tolerated, but never embraced. Imagine growing up in a golden palace, where everyone wears crowns and you wear a helmet, where others are praised for poetry and prophecy, and you are only called when something must bleed. This was Ari's beginning, not the birth of a villain, but the birth of a child who never got to be anything but a weapon, and when a soul is raised to fight, what else can it become? Athena was the goddess of strategy, Apollo, light and reason. Even Artemis brought swift, clean death to those who broke nature's law. But Ares? He was the god no one wanted in the room. Because when Ares arrived, war stopped being poetic. There were no clever plans, no noble sacrifices, only blood, noise, chaos, and deep down, mortals and gods alike knew this is what war actually looks like. When cities burned, it wasn't Athena's scrolls that stood among the ash. When armies collapsed, it wasn't Hermes who lifted the dying. And when mothers wept over their children, it wasn't Apollo's lyre that comforted them. It was Ares, silent, covered in wounds, but still there. He did not bring peace. He did not bring justice. He brought truth, and truth, when drenched in blood, makes people look away. So they hated him for it, not because he was cruel, but because he refused to lie. He didn't dress war up in marble and myth. He didn't hide behind words like honor or destiny. He knew war because he was made from it, and he made the gods confront their own hypocrisy. Do you want to know who truly feared Ares? The poets. Because they couldn't turn him into legend. They couldn't make his violence beautiful. They couldn't write him into a hero without lying. So they gave his stories to Athena instead. They gave the glory of battle to strategy, not survival. And they rewrote the truth so cleanly, you'd forget the battlefield ever bled at all. Ares wasn't perfect. He raged, he roared, he lost control. There were times when he went too far, moments when even the gods had to intervene. But unlike them, Ares never pretended to be something else. When he fought, he did it with his whole being. When he loved like fire. When he protected, it was until the bitter end. He didn't hide behind symbols or morals. He was the raw scream of existence, the pain we bury, the part of us that knows we'd fight like beasts to save what we love. That made him dangerous, not to mortals, but to Olympus, because Ares, for all his flaws, held up a mirror to the gods, and what they saw was their own cowardice. Zeus, king of Olympus, would rage and punish. Poseidon, lord of the seas, would drown thousands for a slight. Hera, queen of heaven, would curse babies in the womb. But Ares, he was too barbaric. The highest truth is, Ares reminded them that power without compassion is still violence. But at least he never lied about it. And so, to protect their image, the gods shamed him. When Ares was caught in love with Aphrodite, they laughed. They humiliated him, not because of the affair, but because they finally had an excuse to call him a fool. Ares, the god of war, trapped in a net, caught in something as human as desire. They called him weak. But perhaps it was the most honest moment of his divine life. Because despite everything, despite war, blood, exile, and rejection, Ares still tried to love, still longed to be accepted, still returned to Olympus, even knowing he'd never truly be one of them. And that, more than anything, is what made the gods uncomfortable, because the god they hated the most was the one who never stopped trying to be more than a weapon. And maybe that's why Ares matters today, because we all know what it feels like to be used, to be misunderstood, to be told we're too much. We live in a world that rewards silence over emotion, control over passion, appearance over honesty. But Ares? He felt everything. He showed up even when unwelcome. He told the ugly truth, even when people didn't want to hear it. In a world of perfect gods and perfect masks, he was real, flawed, bloody, loud, but real. There is a reason Olympus never had two gods of war, Ares and Athena, siblings in title, rivals in everything else. Both were warriors. Both walked the battlefield with divine command. But where Ares brought rage, Athena brought reason. To the mortals, it looked like two paths to victory. To the gods, it was an invisible war between siblings, and a struggle for who defined what war truly meant. Because Ares didn't just fight humans. He fought the idea that war should be clean. Athena believed in calculated battle, in discipline, in clever traps and defensive walls. Ares? He believed in feeling. He charged into battle because fear was real and so was pain. He bled with soldiers. He didn't sit on mountaintops and orchestrate from afar. He was there, in the mud, with a sword, and that terrified the gods, because it meant that humans loved Ares, not for his victories, but for his honesty. He didn't lie about the cost of war. He was the cost, but the gods didn't want honesty. They wanted stories. They wanted Athena, the hero of strategy, the face of righteous battle. She was adored. He was despised. Even in myth, they clashed. In the Trojan War, they took opposite sides. Athena supported the Greeks. Ares supported the Trojans. It wasn't just a divine disagreement. It was personal, because Athena was born from Zeus's head, his mind. Ares was born from Hera's fury, her heart. One was crafted to rule, the other to remind the rulers what happens when they fail. In one famous tale, Athena struck Ares down with help from Diomedes, a mortal warrior. She didn't just beat him. She humiliated him. He screamed, wounded, and fled Olympus. But here's what no one tells you. Ares always came back. Why? Because war always comes back. Athena may have represented the ideal, but Ares represented the inevitable. The gods wanted a clean war story. Ares gave them a bloody truth, and the mortals, they understood. For every noble general, there was a frightened foot soldier. For every grand strategy, a screaming mother. Athena gave humans honor. Ares gave them reality, and in that gap, between glory and grief, the true nature of war was buried. That's why their rivalry never ended, because it was never just a battle between gods. It was a war of definitions. Is war something to be mastered, or something to be survived? Is victory the clean line drawn on a map, or the broken man limping home? And in that argument, Ares stood alone. Not because he was wrong, but because no one wanted to hear what he had to say. So he became the villain in every tale, the enemy in every war. But what if he wasn't? What if the real reason the gods hated Ares was because he made them look away from their illusions? What if he was the only one telling the truth? Ares wasn't the god of evil. He was the god of honesty in its rawest, bloodiest form. And sometimes truth is the most dangerous weapon of all. Ares wasn't just the god of war. He was also the god of desire. But his love story wasn't a fairy tale. It was a battlefield. Among gods and mortals, no love was as complicated as his with Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and passion. She was radiant. He was wrath made flesh. Their union was a paradox, a clash of fire and silk, of fury and grace. While other gods admired Aphrodite for her allure, she chose the one everyone feared, the god no one wanted beside her. Their love was secret, whispered, in shadows and hidden behind veils of divine scandal, because Aphrodite was married. to Hephaestus, the god of fire and craft. But Ares didn't care. For him, love was another war, a battle for acceptance, a fight for connection. Together they stole moments between thunder and silence, passion and pain. But even love couldn't shield Ares from scorn. The gods mocked their affair. They whispered rumors and laughed behind closed doors. To them, Ares was a joke. The brutish lover, the failed god, the outcast. Yet Aphrodite remained loyal. Why? Because she saw what others refused. Behind his fierce exterior was a god desperate to be seen. A god craving not just battle, but belonging. But love didn't erase his curse. It only made the loneliness sharper. For in the eyes of Olympus, Ares was always less noble than Athena, less wise than Zeus, less beloved than Apollo. He was the god they needed but never wanted, and that torment followed him into every fight, every victory, every loss. Even their children, like Eros, the god of love, were shadows of the storm within him. Ares' legacy was never just war. It was the cost of being misunderstood. A god who loved fiercely but was hated for it. A warrior who longed for peace but could only find it in chaos. His passion lay his prison, and in his prison, the truth of Ares was forever trapped. Time passed, wars came and went, empires rose, fell, and wrote history in the blood of the forgotten, and through it all, Ares was there, but no longer as a roaring god on the battlefield, not always as a storm in bronze armor. Sometimes he was, just a whisper, a cold wind before a nation fell, a look in the eyes of a dying soldier, the final silence before the next generation lit the torches again. Because Ares never left. But something had changed. He was no longer worshipped. Temples to Athena stood tall, shrines to Zeus, Apollo, Artemis, all remained. But Ares? The people grew ashamed. They blamed him for their wars, for their rage, as if he had caused it, as if they hadn't built it themselves, and in that shame, they rewrote him. He became a footnote, a brute, an uncontrollable monster. Never mind that it was kings and emperors who marched armies into cities. Never mind that it was mortals who forged swords, who drew borders, who chose conquest over compassion. Ares had always been honest. Too honest. And now, they were erasing him for it. Even mythology did him dirty. Stories painted him as a fool, a loser in battle, beaten by Athena, trapped by Hephaestus, mocked by Zeus. But look closely. These tales weren't just about humiliating Ares. They were about controlling him. Because if you can mock a god, you can ignore what he stands for. They turned Ares into a joke. So no one had to face the truth he represented, the truth that war never disappears, that even in peace, violence lurks in the hearts of men. And perhaps the worst part, Ares knew it. He wasn't ignorant. He wasn't blind. He saw the way Olympus twisted its stories. He saw how mortals begged for his help in times of terror, then spat on his name once peace returned. And yet, he kept showing up. He didn't stop war. He never could. But he never ran from it either. He bore the burden, the cries, the rage, the unbearable grief, because he knew that someone had to. Ares wasn't just the god of war. He was the god of sacrifice, of carrying the weight no one else dared touch. Not glory, not pride, cost. He watched as soldiers buried their brothers. He heard the silence after victory, when no one cheered. He stood in the ruins after both sides lost everything, and still, he remained. Because he was never about winning. He was about truth. In a world of gods who wrapped destruction in poetry and destiny, Ares was the only one who refused to lie. He never claimed war was noble. He never promised salvation through death. He never offered honor for blood. He only showed you what war really was: brutal, bloody, and real, and that was why they hated him, because every god offered hope. Ares, he offered reality, but maybe, just maybe, that's what makes him the most human god of all. He didn't demand worship. He didn't ask to be loved. He just showed up. Every time. And in that silence, after all the songs stopped, it was his name that echoed in the wind. Not because he was evil, but because he was honest. And sometimes truth is harder to forgive than any sin. Ares, the god the gods hated, not because he was evil, but because he was honest. In a world that preferred glory and myths, he was the raw truth of war and human nature. His story is not just about battle, but about the cost we pay when conflict shapes our lives. Remember, sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we most need to face. This is the legacy of Ares, a god who never turned away from reality, no matter how brutal it was. If you've been moved by this story, share it with someone who needs to hear that truth today, because understanding the price of war is the first step toward peace.